Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Coburn, Gene, thank you for being here, and thanks for all the work and for the legacy that you left, Dr. Coburn. I have the opportunity to be able to walk in a long shadow, and I'm glad to be able to walk through that as well. For Gene, what you have done in the work and your team has been remarkable, to say the least. To be able to pull a lot of things together. You and I spoke last year about the possibility of taking the lists as they exist rather than having a large list and breaking it out, what's congressional, what's administrative responsibilities, and so it can be clearly identified as who's got what. You have done that this year, and I appreciate that as well, because that does allow us to be able to say, this is our list, this is our to-do. It moves it from a big list to a big list that is specifically one with our name on it. And so that's very, very helpful in the process as well, to be able to help identify those things. Dr. Coburn, I would have to tell you that I get asked often about the work that you did while you were here and while you sat on this dais. And people will ask me about, did a lot of things, said a lot of things, made a lot of speeches, what really changed? I typically take them back to this, to the work on duplication. And this specific report, to be able to identify here are the things that really made a difference, and it's in the billions of dollars. Not only the administration can see it, the American people can see it, and Congress can choose to act on it or choose to be exposed when they're not. It does make a tremendous difference in the days ahead, and I hope we can continue that. While you were on the Senate side, I was on the House side, we were both working on a bill called the Taxpayers' Right to Know. That has moved significantly. It moved through the House while I was there. It stalled here in the Senate. It has now moved completely through the House again, 413 to 0 this time. We have a version that we've worked through on a bipartisan way here and is being held up by a single member. We feel like that is at the behest of OMB. It's interesting, Gene, when you brought up a lot of your questions and your statements to OMB on why they've not reacted on some of the transparency, they referred over and over again to they anticipate the taxpayers' right to know is going to pass, and when it passes, then they'll actually take on these things, but they're not going to do them until it passes. We also believe that OMB is helping charge not to move it here for whatever reason. Part of that may be the program thresholds. Currently, the program threshold is $1 million. For every program that's greater than $1 million, we have to have a list. Gene, you and I in 2013 had an interchange about this same issue, trying to identify, based on the Data Act and other things that are out there, what information do we have and not have, and determine at that time, even in our conversation, we don't have a list of every program, how much is spent on that program, if that program is evaluated at all, what was the evaluation of that program, how many full-time employees are dedicated to that program, just a simple, straightforward list that every business in America has. Every one of them has some kind of tracking on that. We don't have that in the federal government. So we go to GAO to do this large-scale report when that should be something that every watchdog group should be able to have out on a list, and should be an app that's publicly available so you can clearly see it. But right now, that can't be done because we don't have that. So let me just come to a question on it. The $1 million threshold versus a $10 million threshold, what does that do for program transparency and the number of programs that may be duplicative that you cannot see?
I think the $1 million threshold is a reasonable request by Congress. There could be some implementation problems, largely because OMB hasn't defined programs. That requirement's been in place for a long time under the GPRA Modernization Act. They punted that to the Data Act. They're supposed to do it under the Data Act. That's not being done. So I think there's a lot of confusion right now because there's not a definition of program. And because of that, I think there's like probably over 1,000 programs in the catalog of federal domestic assistance that are between $1 million and $10 million. Right. So you need to have that visibility. You need to have that transparency. They may have some difficulties in implementation, but I think you have to move in that direction if you really want to have a clear, transparent, accountable government.
So you're basically not going to see 1,000 programs or more if you have that definitional change.
There's a good possibility of that, yes.
Okay, let me ask you about the new hire database. Well, actually, let me pause before we do that. Dr. Coburn, any comments you want to make on taxpayers' right to know? You worked very hard on this for the Senate in a long time.
I'd just say, if in fact OMB is the holdup in it, it's the same thing we heard on the Transparency Act, is it's too hard to implement. Right. Costs too much money. Well, what they found out is it was a little hard to implement, but it didn't cost near as much money. They bought a program from Sunlight Foundation and implemented it. And the same thing could happen on this. It's not hard.
Right.
What it is people, if they're not being held accountable, they don't want to be held accountable. And transparency is what holds them accountable. So the Taxpayers' Right to Know Act is just as essential as any other thing we've done in terms of transparency so the American people can know. So what you're really doing is fighting a dark force that doesn't want the American people to know what's going on up here. And the American people are saying, hey, we kind of get it. You know, we kind of get it. And that's why, you know, you're at 5%. And that's why you're seeing the politics of America today. And so, you know, and everybody's responsible for that. That's not partisan. That's the fact that there's not this reconciliation and working together to get things done.
Right. Gene, talk to me about the new hire database. Why is that needed? You mentioned that earlier in your opening testimony. That is something that all of us support here. Why is that needed?
Well, there are a lot of federal programs where they're means tested based on income statistics. The new hire database, which was initially put in to help on child support enforcement, is the authoritative database on new employment and has the most up-to-date wage information in there. And so if you can use that information to compare against decisions that are made, and a lot of means-tested program, people self-report their income. And so you don't really have a means of checking through third-party information to know whether what's being self-reported is right, whether it's up to date, and a lot of changes take place. So this database is essential. It's easy to use. You know, once we get access to it, the OMB initially complained. We went to all the states and had to get it from the states. And that's very time-consuming and labor-intensive. And we believe we have the authority, but Congress needs to clarify it. This will help us do this work on overlap, duplication, and fragmentation in a much more efficient and effective way.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, again, thank you for being here and for the ongoing work. I yield back.
Well, Senator Lankford, first of all, I agree. You've got some big shoes to fill, but you're doing a pretty good job. You're doing an excellent job as the chairman of the subcommittee on regulation, working in a very bipartisan fashion with Senator Heidkamp. I truly appreciate that. And your Taxpayer Right to Know Act is part of this package, and it was introduced first in 2011. Let me just list the co-sponsors right now. It's Lankford, McCaskill, Johnson, Ayotte, Heidkamp, Enzi, McCain, Portman, Peters, Paul, Fisher. That's what we're trying to put together here. And I truly appreciate your participation in that. Senator Carper?
About to have votes that are called, so let me catch the chase. I've got several things I'd love to be able to talk about, both with the federal fleets and the management of that, and several recommendations you have on that, and quite a few other areas on Social Security disability, things that we've worked on together in the past, and things that are very obvious. And I was just as frustrated last October when that budget piece passed that included an incredible punt on Social Security disability. And the frustration is we never seemed to fix anything here until we had a deadline. We finally had a deadline to do something, and it was punted for 7 years instead of actually facing it. So we'll have to deal with that in the days ahead. The issue I want to be able to bring and be able to drive home, though, deals with emergency spending and rescissions. There's some conversation moving around Congress right now that there are some important things that are happening right now with Zika and with opioids and with Flint and other things. And the conversation is, these are emergencies. We need to break the caps. We need to have something uniquely different on it because it's very important. Your report also details things like the HARP program and multiple other areas where there are rescissions and deobligated balances, where there are billions of dollars that are still sitting there, basically obligated to programs that aren't functioning anymore. Can you give me a little bit of detail about that? Is your microphone on right there, Gene?
Sorry, excuse me. Yeah, we have several recommendations that focus on suggested rescissions that we put in place. This is an area Dr. Coburn and I talked about early on. It's hard to do, but we have 3 examples of where there's money that could be rescinded. I'll provide those for the record. They're in our recommendations to the Congress. One is the alternative vehicle manufacturing program. We think there's about $4 billion there. There's unobligated balances at the Energy Department and the State Department of several $100 billion we think could be done there. The home mortgage improvement program under the TARP program, as you mentioned, we think there's potential there for $2 or $3 billion in rescissions that could take place as well. So we've highlighted those in there, in the report, and I would encourage Congress to act on them.
Okay, thank you. I'll yield back because we're getting close to vote time.